You wake up every morning believing you know your own mind. You walk through the world convinced that your thoughts, your sensations, your most intimate desires are genuinely yours, that they emerge from some deep and authentic place within your being. But what if I told you that all of this is nothing more than an elaborate fiction, a construction as artificial as the buildings you observe from your window, as fabricated as the words you are reading right now? Wilfrid Sellars, that philosopher whom few know but whose ideas pierce reality like sharpened daggers, invites you to confront an uncomfortable truth: there is no such thing as direct access to your own mental experience. Every time you believe you know what you feel, every time you tell yourself, "I'm hungry" or "I feel sad," you are employing a vocabulary you did not invent, a grammar of experience that you have absorbed from the social world around you. Your mind, that fortress you believed impregnable, is actually a territory colonized by the language of others. Think about this precise moment. As you process these words, you believe you are living a purely personal, intimate experience. But the truth is that even your capacity to recognize that you are thinking or understanding depends on concepts you have learned from others. No one is born knowing they have thoughts or feelings. These are names that society has given to certain behavioral patterns, certain tendencies, certain dispositions that others observed in you before you yourself were capable of recognizing them. Sellars' conceptual revolution is brutal in its simplicity. Before you can speak of your private mental states, you must already master the public language about mental states. That is, you learn to identify sadness in others before you can identify it in yourself. You learn to recognize others' pain before conceptualizing your own suffering. Your supposed inner life is, in reality, an inward projection of what you first learned to see outward. This is not a poetic metaphor, it is a literal description of how your mind works. When you were a child, you had no privileged access to your own mental states. Adults observed your behavior, your gestures, your cries and screams, and gradually taught you to use words like pain, joy, fear to describe what you were experiencing. But here lies the disturbing part: they weren't teaching you to recognize something that was already there, clearly defined. They were teaching you to create those categories, to divide the continuous and indeterminate flow of your experience into discrete compartments that coincided with the words available in your language. The culture in which you grew up did not discover your emotions, it invented them. The emotional vocabulary you possess is not a neutral translation of pre-existing internal realities, but a mold that shapes those realities. An Eskimo has dozens of words for different types of snow, and therefore can perceive distinctions that are invisible to you. Similarly, your emotional culture determines which nuances of experience you can identify and which remain in shadow, nameless, non-existent to your consciousness. But Sellars' penetration goes much deeper. Not only is your emotional vocabulary a social construction, all your conscious experience is structured by concepts you have absorbed from outside. When you look at a sunset and feel beauty, that aesthetic experience is shaped by centuries of cultural tradition, by poems you have read, by paintings you have seen, by conversations you have heard about what counts as beautiful. Without that cultural background, without that unconscious aesthetic education, the sun descending to the horizon would simply be a luminous phenomenon without particular meaning. Even your most basic perception, which you believe completely natural and immediate, is impregnated with theory. When you see a red object, you are not simply registering an objective property of the world. You are applying a learned concept. You are classifying an experience according to categories that your community has transmitted to you. The red you see is as much a conceptual construction as a physical reality. And this extends to everything: the sounds you hear, the tastes you identify, the textures you perceive. Every perception is already an interpretation. Every sensation is mediated by language and categories that society has inscribed in your nervous system. Are you beginning to feel the vertigo? That sensation that the firm ground of your personal experience is crumbling beneath your feet? It's natural. Sellars is showing you that what you considered most private, most intimate, most genuinely yours, is actually the product of a social process of meaning construction. Your mind is not a mysterious entity that inhabits some protected interior space. It is a node in a network of linguistic and conceptual practices that extends through your community and culture. This has devastating implications for your sense of personal identity. If your thoughts, emotions, and perceptions are structured by socially acquired concepts, what remains of you that is authentically individual? Where does social influence end and where does the true self begin? The disturbing answer is that perhaps there is no such division. Perhaps the true self you seek is simply another social construction, another useful fiction that your culture has taught you to maintain. But Sellers doesn't stop here. His analysis becomes even more radical when he examines what he calls the myth of the given. This myth is the belief that there exists some level of pure, non-conceptual experience that serves as the indubitable foundation for all our knowledge. It is the idea that, beneath all interpretations and social constructions, there is a level of direct, immediate experience that cannot be questioned because it is simply given to consciousness. This myth permeates your daily life. When you say, "I see that it's raining," or "I feel pain," you believe you are reporting basic, incontestable facts that present themselves directly to your consciousness without conceptual mediation. But Sellers shows you that even these apparently simple reports are loaded with theory. Seeing rain implies having the concept of rain, distinguishing between rain and other meteorological phenomena, knowing what counts as evidence of rain. Feeling pain implies having learned to classify certain sensations as pain in opposition to pleasure, itch, pressure, or heat. There is no pure experience. All conscious experience is always already interpreted, always already structured by concepts you have internalized through your social education. What you take for immediate experience is actually the result of a complex process of conceptual learning that began in your childhood and continues until now, in this very moment as you try to understand these ideas. The most disturbing implication of all this is that your inner life, that dimension of experience you considered most private and inaccessible to others, is actually less private than you imagine. If your mental concepts are socially acquired, then others who share your cultural background have, in principle, access to the same conceptual resources that you use to interpret your experience. The difference between first-person and third-person perspective is not as absolute as you believed. This doesn't mean that others can read your mind or that there are no individual differences in experience. It means something more subtle and deeper, that the conceptual structure you use to make sense of your experience is neither unique nor original, but shared. Your most intimate thoughts are constructed with public tools. Your most personal emotions are shaped by cultural patterns. Your most direct perceptions are mediated by implicit theories you have learned from others. Can you feel how this destabilizes your sense of personal autonomy? How it questions the idea that you are the sovereign author of your own experience? Sellers is showing you that you are less independent than you believed, more permeable to social influence, more constructed by external forces than your natural narcissism wants to admit. But there is something even more disturbing. If your mind is a social construction, then it is also a historical construction. The concepts you use to interpret your experience are neither eternal nor universal. They are products of specific historical developments. The emotional vocabulary available in your culture is different from what the ancient Greeks had or what future generations will have. This means that aspects of experience that are fundamental and obvious to you might be completely foreign to people of other epochs or cultures. Consider the modern notion of depression. This diagnostic category, which now seems to describe a natural and objective reality, is actually a relatively recent invention. 300 years ago, the symptoms we now classify as depression were interpreted in terms of bodily imbalances, spiritual possession, or simply as normal variations of human temperament. Does this mean that depression didn't exist before we conceptually invented it? Or does it mean it always existed but we didn't recognize it? Sellers suggests a third, more radical option, that depression as a distinctive phenomenon of human experience is as much created as discovered by our conceptual practices. This perspective extends to your entire emotional life. Romantic love, that experience you consider universal and timeless, is largely an invention of medieval European literature. Existential anxiety, that feeling you believe so fundamental to the modern human condition, would have been incomprehensible to most historical cultures. Even your sense of time, space, causality are shaped by specific concepts your culture has developed. This is not superficial cultural relativism. It's not the banal idea that different cultures have different customs. It's something much deeper. The very structure of your conscious experience, what you feel as most natural and inevitable in you, is the product of contingent conceptual developments that could have been different. Are you beginning to see the political dimension of all this? If your mind is a social construction, then it is also a battlefield where different social forces compete to define the terms in which you experience your own life. The concepts you use to interpret your experience are not neutral, they reflect specific interests, power relations, structures of domination. When you learn to see certain behaviors as normal and others as pathological, when you absorb ideas about which emotions are appropriate for your gender, when you internalize notions about which desires are legitimate and which shameful, you are being formed by systems of power that operate through language and concepts. Your most private inner life is traversed by social dynamics of control and conformity. The institutions that surround you, family, school, media, medicine, religion, don't just regulate your external behavior, they shape the conceptual structure you use to interpret yourself. They teach you not only how to act, but how to feel, how to desire, how to suffer. They provide you not only with rules of conduct, but with categories of experience. Sellers is showing you that your resistance to this social influence is more limited than you believe. You cannot simply decide to free yourself from socially constructed concepts because those concepts constitute the very structure of your capacity to consciously experience. Attempting to experience without concepts is like attempting to see without eyes or think without language. Concepts are not external tools you can take or leave, they are the condition of possibility of your conscious life. But this doesn't condemn you to total passivity. Although you cannot completely escape the social construction of your mind, you can make it conscious. You can begin to recognize the concepts that structure your experience as contingent historical constructions instead of immutable natural truths. You can develop a critical sensitivity toward the categories you use to interpret yourself. This critical consciousness is paradoxical. It requires using socially constructed concepts to critically examine the social construction of concepts. It's like using a map to navigate territory, knowing all the while that the map is not the territory but a particular interpretation of it. But this paradox doesn't make it useless, it makes it profoundly human. Sellers' project is not to free you from the social construction of mind, that is impossible, but to help you inhabit it more consciously. His philosophy invites you to live in the tension between recognizing the contingency of your mental categories and continuing to use them to navigate life. It proposes a form of authenticity that doesn't depend on accessing some true, pre-social self, but on consciously and critically appropriating the conceptual resources you have inherited. Here, in this moment, as you finish reading these reflections, your mind is being transformed by the ideas you have encountered. Sellers' concepts are integrating into your conceptual apparatus, subtly altering the way you interpret your experience. You can no longer pretend total innocence about the social construction of your mental life. You have lost the illusion of complete transparency of your own mind. This loss is also a gain. You have gained a more sophisticated perspective on yourself, a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between individual and society, an increased capacity to critically examine the categories you take for granted. You have acquired what Sellers would call a scientific image of the human mind that complements and questions the manifest image of common sense. The task you now face is not to resolve this tension, but to learn to live productively within it. Recognizing that your mind is a social construction doesn't magically free you from that construction, but it allows you to inhabit it with greater consciousness and, perhaps, with greater freedom. A freedom that doesn't consist in fleeing from social determinations, but in understanding them well enough to appropriate them reflectively. Your mind will continue to be a social construction, but now it is a social construction that knows itself as such. And that difference, however subtle it may be, can be revolutionary.